Good evening, everyone. This is Stephanie Evanet, your Chief Executive at AustCham Hong Kong. I'm really pleased to have joining us today Glenda Korporaal, who is going to talk with us about Australia-China relations, business in China, and some other interesting tidbits from the mood in Australia right now as we head into a federal election. And we have some really ongoing significant developments with the pandemic, as well as natural disasters, geopolitics. There's a lot happening to frame a conversation. Glenda, welcome.
Thank you very much. And of course, I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years and I was a member of your chamber. So I know it and I got a lot out of it being a member of it. So I can say firsthand, I actually paid out of my own pocket. So that was, I know what the valuable work that your organisation does.
Thank you so much, Glenda. And we're so pleased to have you back joining us today. And thank you for your support. I know that many of you are watching tonight will know Glenda and her work, but I would like to make an introduction before we jump into the questions. You're working in a number of roles right now, Glenda. You're an Adjunct Industry Fellow at the Australia-China Relations Institute with the University of Technology, Sydney. You're based in Sydney with the Australian newspaper, and of course you specialise in business, financial affairs and international relations. And you've worked globally, not just here in Hong Kong, of course in London, Washington and New York for the AFR. And you were the first woman deputy editor of the AFR in the late 80s. You've been business editor with the Bulletin magazine. You've edited the Australian's monthly business magazine, The Deal, and an associate editor business with the Australian. You first went to China in 1978 on a farm study tour, and you were the China correspondent for the Australian in 2018 and 19. And of course, as you mentioned, you were in Hong Kong in the early 2000s, and prior to that in Singapore. You also have a strong interest in the Olympics. I know you've covered a lot of the games: Atlanta, Nagano, Sydney, Athens, Beijing, and London. And you've written a number of books on the subject as well. You were awarded in 2019 recognition of an Order of Australia Medal for your contribution to print journalism. And we're so thrilled to have your expertise today. We're going to jump into some questions. And we really want to focus on, the Australia-China relationship. And we know that, over the past few years, particularly accelerated by the pandemic and China's leadership under President Xi, has really seen a decoupling from a lot of international trade and geopolitical relationships. Australia's trade with China has also suffered under sanctions and trade actions on barley, wine, beef, and other commodities and products. And we've had this ongoing strained diplomatic relationship. We have a new Chinese ambassador appointed to Australia. And I know that he met recently with Minister Payne and many other senior Australian politicians, as well as representatives from the business community. I'm curious, Glenda, for your take on what's the mood in Australia in terms of the Australia-China relationship, particularly in relation to trade and business?
Well, it's hard to, essentially, the business ties are still pretty strong. I mean, when you talk to people in business who have done long time business with China, whether it's the mining companies or whether it's Blackmores, Bubs, Treasury Wine Estate that makes Penfolds. There's Cochlear, which have got they're building a factory in Chengdu. There's the business community wants to do business in China, but they are keeping a low profile because of the politics. And the politics is, I think, somebody made the point that in the past few days, this is at a low point. We are, so politically, the Morrison government has clashed with Xi administration, but obviously there's, China's had a much more aggressive diplomatic stance as well, taken action against trade. So political relations are very sensitive, but in this lead up to the election, it's quite key. But underlying, you talk to people doing business, Australians doing business in China, they want to continue to do business in China if they sort of humanly can.
And it's an incredibly important market for Australian business. And you mentioned some of those really, flagship companies that are invested in China and also continue to trade. I'm interested to know, though, is China still welcoming of foreign investment and trade?
I think there's two issues. There's foreign investment and then there's trade. If you look at Chinese investment into Australia, I mean, I don't know if I'm putting a little bit too bluntly, but the Chinese feel it's not welcome. It's fallen away a lot. We've got an example here of a building company called ProBuild, which was owned by a South African company. It's just gone into voluntary administration. A year ago, a Chinese building company offered to buy that company, and the government stepped in and blocked it. And now hopefully it'll be sold. But I think the level of Chinese investment in Australia has gone down, and unfortunately, it's going to be affected by politics. But to put that aside, the trade is still strong. And when you look at it, if you're putting iron ore on a bulk ship carrier and sending it to China, you actually don't physically have to go there either. So, I mean, whether there's COVID or not, there's export. And the other issue we might be able to talk about is the advent of e-commerce. And organisations got Alibaba. I mean, people can literally sit in their lounge room in Australia and put their product up, their baby food or their face cream, and sell it to China. So essentially, the business is still being done, but investment, I think either way, I think Australian companies are very reluctant also to put too many dollars on the ground, but trade is still, I think, pretty strong. Not as good as it was, but still pretty strong.
Last year, Glenda, you released a report in collaboration with ACRI, the Australia-China Research Institute at UTS, and you interviewed a number of leading resources, services and consumer firms from Australia about their business in China. What led to that research, and why do you think it's important that research like this is undertaken?
Well, that came about that last year, James Lawrenson, who runs ACRI, does a very good job doing that, I must say. It's the only Australia-China Relations Institute in Australia. He said, and we were talking about this fact that while businesses while the politics is difficult and very strained, business people were still, I mean, the figures still probably show that Australian trade with China is still over 200 billion both ways. And he sort of challenged me to see how many people I could speak to. And over the many years, I've dealt with a lot of people and interviewed people. There were a couple that I think just thought it was a bit too hot to talk to me, for the record. There's a lot of people say off the record. But I was actually amazed how many companies I was able to speak to. I mean, there was Woodside, Fortescue, Elders, Mark Allison at Elders. He's a long-term gone to China for many years. Blackmores, Sue Kench I spoke to, of course, who's in Hong Kong, doing an amazing job running one of what's now King & Wood Mallison, what's now one of the biggest law firms in Asia. And they celebrate this year their 10-year anniversary. So I found that, actually I found it quite uplifting in a way, because one of the things that showed to me is that people who do business in China or want to do business with China, and the same with Hong Kong, is these people haven't just sort of woken up and done it. They've got a very long experience going back and forward, and they've had all sorts of, if you're in global trade, you have all sorts of issues. So I thought they were much more resilient in their determination to keep doing business than I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a kind of a surprising outcome. And I know that in the context that you were talking about, and particularly, I guess the media reporting around China and business in China. And I wonder if there were other surprises for you from this report. You're very experienced, business and China journalist. What other surprises were there from undertaking that research for you?
Well, one of the companies that I wasn't even going to bother to interview was TWE, Treasury Wine Estate, because Penfolds, as you know, is their flagship brand, but they also sell raw. When I was in Beijing, I used to buy Rawson's Retreat for about $10. So that's from my local supermarket. But I was not going to talk to them because I thought, well, they've been hit with these tariffs. There's no way, it's all over. And in fact, then someone said, no, their chief executive, Tim Ford, is saying, no, we're not out of China by any means. And he's, again, a veteran. He is only recently in the last 2 years perhaps taken over that role, but he's in his previous career working in the same company. He's gone back and forward to China many times. And he said, no, we are continuing to do business in China, and they have operations in America where they now make, in California, they now make Penfolds, and they're now exporting that to Hong Kong, to China. And they have plans, and I think even this year they will sell Penfolds made in France into China. And what they've done, and this is another thing that Australian companies, people have had to redo their approach. Rawson's Retreat, I think they're selling out of South Africa into China, and they're possibly going to do it through South America. So that was a surprise how determined that chief executive was to keep accessing the China market. And the Penfolds globally is still run out of Shanghai. And again, that's a commitment. When you consider COVID and politics, it's a pretty big commitment from a company. So, and then I'll just mention Bubs, which has recently done a deal. That was founded by Christy Carr, who actually lived in Hong Kong for a while, had a sense of the Chinese market, went back to Australia, had kids, and anyway, started to get into the goat's milk infant formula business. But while she was doing that, she could see the China potential. And they've recently got, and they are going to diversify. They're not going to put all their eggs in the China basket. They're selling into America, but they recently have got a Hong Kong investor. So, I mean, they're just two examples of a determination by these companies to keep connecting with China. And I think the hope is, I don't know, who can predict the future, but I mean, we are looking to a May election. If there's a change of government, I think Labor would adopt a different tone in the relationship. So, who knows, in a few years' time, do things pick up? And business is very long term. I mean, so what I'm saying is, I suppose the surprising resilience of these companies.
Yeah, and this incredible agility as well, and willingness to pull on their global operations to serve the demand in the market for Australian products, and the continuing, value that Chinese consumers place on, Australian products and Australian, particularly in those couple of examples, wine and baby food formula.
Yeah.
You mentioned the election, Glenda. We're in March. We're due, I think, by last third week of May. So, what's the mood? What's your view in terms of the impact of a potential change of government, or indeed if the incumbent government remains, if the Morrison government remains in power after May? How do you think those two scenarios could impact on the Australia-China relationship?
I think you get two very different outcomes. Although the Labor Party is at great pains to sort of play down any difference. People are starting to call it a khaki election here. The Treasurer has already said there's going to be a big increase in defence spending, and Peter Dutton, the Defence Minister, continues to single out both China and Russia. Obviously, with the Ukraine situation, it heightens tension, but it's not just you, he mentions China and Russia. And so the government is definitely going to ratchet up, and there've been accusations in Parliament. I can't remember who called, Morrison called someone a Manchurian candidate. I mean, we have heard this before. That's right. I remember Malcolm Turnbull kept calling Kevin Rudd that, and some of these old, reds under the bed sort of scenarios are getting dredged up here, and it'll probably get a lot rougher before it's over. The scenario regarding the election, by the way, is that there's going to be a budget on March 29, and the view seems to be that after that they will pull the trigger and announce the election. So you've got a government. Look, the Morrison government, when you talk to people at Austrade, they still want to trade with China, but they're also banging that sort of drums of war drum. And I think Penny Wong, who will be the foreign minister, and Albanese will be more, I think they'll have a nuanced rhetoric as it comes to China. And that's what I think the appointment of this ambassador, Xiao Chan, who's from Indonesia, very senior, I think he's been sent here in case there's a change of government, and I think he has a capacity. And when he arrived in January, he said, we hopefully we can repair relations. So I think if you had a change of government and you've got this new ambassador, there is a chance for this reset that we all talk about. But it takes two to tango. It's Australia and China, and the world is looking at China's reaction on the Ukraine. And that I think will affect how people think of China as well.
Yeah. One of the things that was led to us having this conversation was the report that you released. It got coverage, of course, in the Australian media and here in Hong Kong as well. And it was a pretty, a relatively positive story, I guess, in terms of, the overall media coverage, whether that's around what's happening here in Hong Kong or between Australia's relationship with China. What role do you think, Glenda, the media has to play in, I guess, stoking some of that public perception of whether it's trade or business or indeed the diplomatic relationship? Just curious on your view about that.
Well, I think there is two streams of reporting, as we've talked about the difference between the business and the politics. And I'd say most of the political reporting across the media is coming in behind this critical, almost an approach which is quite critical of China. There's commentators, the Sydney Morning Herald's Peter Harcher. It's also not, it's across many forums like the ABC, what I call the Fairfax media, the news media. So I suppose I'm in a bit of a minority, but my focus is to not write politics, but business. But certainly, if you just, and this is what is difficult for Chinese diplomats, if they wake up and just read the media here, it's very critical of China, and it's quite negative. And part of that too is that the business people I speak to, some of them are very careful and they've had experiences where they put their head up and said something. I mean, Twiggy Forrest being one, I think Kerry Stokes being another, and they've got attacked. So, so the media, but you have some other interesting things here. Stan Grant, who lived in Hong Kong for a while, I think it was CNN, and he lived up in China. He's got something on Monday night on the ABC. I think it's called China Tonight or something. And that's a very interesting, it's worth watching. You can download it, and that he's trying to do complicated and all sorts of things. So, but overwhelmingly, I think at the moment it's quite critical, the media, and this is what happens also when borders are closed and people can't travel. You know how it is. You see something in one country and you think, oh, I'll never go there, and then people come back and forward and say, no, it's really fine. And so we're not having Chinese tourists here, where perhaps some Chinese students come back. We're not having people travel back and forward to China or even back and forward to Hong Kong. So we're not getting another anecdotal offset to perhaps the political tensions.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You know, the people to people relations, and of course you know, were one of those early pioneers out of Australia to you know, tread that path. And you know, I guess with the ongoing, well, the uncertainty, certainly here in Hong Kong and China is similar in that the border closures, we don't know when that will loosen for international arrivals and international tourists and business and study tours. I mean, how can that be restored, I guess, in the absence of the border of the borders reopening? Where do you see those pathways, Glenda, for that engagement, that people to people engagement?
Well, I think there has been a little bit of Chinese students coming in, I think this calendar year. The ball in that point, well, Australians aren't going to Hong Kong at the moment, because, well, you know, unless they actually have to for whatever. But I mean, because of the quarantine issue, and that's, you know, I know people who'd love to go there, or who have business there, or who have come back here or go to Singapore, and they go, oh, look, I'm just not going to do 3 weeks quarantine. But the tourism, I think, is also is linked by the controls on the China side. I think, again, if you have to quarantine for long periods of time, you know, and you're only coming here for 2 weeks, why would you do it? So I think, but Australia's opened the borders just recently to general people to come in and out. But I think the restrictions are on the Chinese side. If they look, I don't know what happens after the Party Congress in China in November, whether Xi Jinping feels that he can relax things a little bit more. But we're not expecting any opening of the borders in terms of tourists coming here until next year, or maybe even the year after. I mean, look, you know, hopefully it can be a bit better than that, but I wouldn't expect perhaps things will ease off in China till, you know, till the end of the year, after the Party Congress is over.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that insight and your sharing with us. We have a very interesting year ahead of us, and certainly the next few months as things develop, both with the Ukraine, with the ongoing leading into the election, and look forward to reconnecting with you, Glenda, if you're up for it post-election, and let's have a discussion about what the landscape looks like. Thanks so much again for your time, and we'll have a good evening.
All right, thank you, and best of wishes for a really good AGM. And I repeat, the organisations do an amazing job in keeping this trade alive, but also in you know, in the people to people contact, allowing people to meet and share information. So I'm pleased to be able to talk to you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.